event we're having with our friends from the Center for Latin American Studies, and so thank you everyone from kind of both centers who's helped to plan this, and to Juliana who kind of had the brilliant idea in the first place. Here to introduce Professor Mara Viveros of Vigoya, who's currently the Simón Bolívar Professor at the Center for Latin American Studies here at the University of Cambridge. She's also professor at the School of Gender Studies and the Department of Anthropology at Universidad Federal de Colombia. There she co-founded and directed thrice. That's a lot of terms of directing. I know something about it. The university's School for Gender Studies, and is co-director of the research group Interdisciplinary Gender Studies, with degrees in economics, Latin America. Speaking of interdisciplinary, Mara is an interdisciplinary scholar in gender studies with degrees in economics, Latin American studies, and anthropology, and her research interests include social inequality, gender and sexuality theories, metamasculinities, biopolitics and sexualities, the intersections of gender, sexuality, class, and ethnicity in Latin American societies, racism and anti-racism struggles, and her current interests include Black middle classes in Colombia, anti-racist ideologies, practices, and cultures in Latin America, and the study of metamasculinities from a feminist perspective. As a translator of Spanish of Aimé Césaire's work, she has recently become interested in the unsung contributions of women to the negritude movement. And she's author of a number of academic books, including Breaking the Boundaries of the Colombian Social Racial Order, Black Middle Classes Through an Intersectional Lens, and is editor of the book Black Feminism, Teoria Crítica, Violencias en Racismo, Conversaciones entre Angela Davis and Egina Dent. And so with that, I will turn it over to you now. We're very excited that you're here speaking with us.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you today. I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share these reflections and dialogue with you. Am I especially grateful to Pedro Méndez Loureiro, to Mónica Moreno Figueroa, and Paola Lopez from the Center of Latin American Studies, and also to the Center for Gender Studies, particularly Dr. Juliana Carvalho, who invited me, all of whom made this event possible and who trusted me to deliver this conference in English. A special mention for Jane Tien and Millie Hind, who accompanied and pushed me to improve my confidence in presenting this talk in this strange language. My opening reflections. Let me begin with the fundamental question. Why talk about intersectionality and why now? This very word has landed on a blacklist circulating around universities and institutions across the United States, along with phrases such as anti-racism, discrimination, feminism, gender, LGBTQ+, and mental health. These topics have been deemed controversial or even dangerous since the Trump administration issued a decree eliminating policies in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion this year. Reading about events like these in the news gives me pause. It pushes me to reflect on the themes I work with, topics I care about deeply. The current context demands that they be revisited. It gives them new meaning, new urgency. Today, we are witnessing a linguistic crusade. Words like woke are weaponized to attack anything that sounds progressive, feminist, environmentalist, or queer. The language war goes hand in hand with the banning of books across the US since 2021. Many of the ever 16,000 banned books deal with slavery, gender inequality, and stories about LGBT plus or racialized characters. In the wake of this, the concept of intersectionality, of hate, has emerged, which helps us understand how various forms of rejections and violence intersect and reinforce one another. In 2016, African-American writer Rembert Brown observed that Trump had successfully united diverse groups such as sexist and racist, not through ideas, but through shared hatred. French historian Christine Barr built on this in 2017 during a conference on anti-feminism, using the term to describe how racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia intersect in far-right media discourse in France. Intersectionality has become central in contemporary feminist studies and movements, expanding to include other forms of oppression such as age, disability, and sexual orientation. However, anti-feminism has also become intersectional in its hatred. We saw this clearly in Bolsonaro's Brazil, where sociologist Eric Fassin described a neoliberal intersectional laboratory in which the emancipatory goal of intersectionality was reversed. In my 2023 book, Intersectionality, the book is in Spanish, it's Interseccionalidad, Giro decolonial y comunitario. Intersectionality, the decolonial and communitarian term. I analyzed how this concept was key to candidacy of Francia Marquez in Colombia's 2022 presidential election. Her life story, marked by social, racial, and gender marginalization, stood in stark contrast to those who have traditionally held power in the country. In a society where race functions as a marker of class and where racism reinforces gender hierarchies, her presence made visible how racism, sexism, and classism operate jointly. From that position, she used the word intersectionality to name the multiple forms of violence she sought to eliminate. Her message resonated deeply with feminists, with LGBT plus people, with indigenous and Afro-descended movements, and with all those who felt historically excluded, with the nobodies. As Eduardo Galeano would say, those who have always been denied dignity and rights. That is why I believe it's more important now than ever to talk about intersectionality, to understand its history, to explore its potential, and to claim it as a political tool to resist the times we are living on. And with this reflection, I begin my presentation. In this talk, I will reflect on the journey intersectionality has made as a theoretical, methodological, and political perspective. Intersectionality has traveled in two directions, from the margins to the center and back again. It started on its winding course from the moment the term was coined in 1991 by Kimberlé Crenshaw. It was then popularized in academic circles after the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, held in South Africa in 2001, and its relevance has endured to the present day. Reflecting on this journey, I intend to describe and analyze the different stages through which intersectionality has passed. This includes the intensification of its use over the last decade, in which we have seen the massification of feminism as a political movement. These more recent events have redefined the concept of the margins. Genealogies of intersectional thinking. For some years now, intersectionality has been used to describe a theoretical and methodological perspective that views power relations as overlapping and interlocking. This framework, while recently named, has deep roots in feminist thought. Feminist theories have long addressed the limitations of approach that isolate power structures, highlighting how such models exclude the experiences of many women, especially those marginalized by race, class, or sexuality. This exclusion was forcefully challenged by Black women in the United States, particularly through abolitionist and civil rights struggles. The Combating Rebel Collective, one of the most active Black feminist groups on the 1970s, offered a foundational expression of intersectional thinking. Their Black feminist statement emphasized a commitment to combating interlocking systems of racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, laying essential groundwork for what would later be known as intersectionality. Intersectional thinking matured in the late 20th century during a time of major global shifts, anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements, the rise of multicultural democracies, and the challenge to apartheid. Thinkers like Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, and June Jordan critiqued the dominance of white middle classes perspective within feminism. They exposed how the category of woman had been constructed through privileged experiences marginalizing others. Meanwhile, in 1980s, in Brazil, a powerful Black women's movement was advancing its own intersectional agenda. Activists such as Lelia Gonzalez and Sueli Carneiro promoted the concept of the race-class-gender triad to explain difference among Brazilian women, difference ignored by dominant feminist discourses. Their work, though rarely recognized internationally, is crucial to the genealogy of intersectionality. At the 1983 Latin American and Caribbean Feminist Encounter in Lima, Brazilian, Caribbean, and Uruguayan Black feminists pressed the movement to address racism. Their efforts led to greater regional coordination and culminated in the 1992 first meeting of Latin American and Caribbean Black women in the Dominican Republic. There, 350 women from 32 countries created an agenda that called out the racial inequalities embedded in development models and structural adjustment policies. These diverse historical contributions reveal that what we now term as intersectionality has long been present in feminist thought and activism. What is new? It is more recent circulation across academic and political spheres as a central framework for addressing differences, diversity, and systemic inequality. Now, I describe the journey made by intersectionality from the margins to the center. The concept of intersectionality as such was coined by US lawyer Kimberlé Crenshaw in 1989 as a tool designed to overcome the legal invisibility of the multiple dimensions of oppression experienced at that time by Black women in the world of work. Intersectionality, she wrote, designates the various ways in which race and gender interact to shape the multiple dimensions of Black women's work experiences. With this understanding, Crenshaw hoped to highlight the fact that Black women in the United States were exposed to violence and discrimination on the basis of both race and gender. Above all, she sought to create concrete legal categories to address discrimination on multiple and varied levels. The court had rejected a claim made by 5 Black female workers that the General Motors seniority system had discriminated against them. Crenshaw argued that the court's refusal to recognize combined race and sex discrimination was based on the fact that the boundaries of sex and race discrimination were defined respectively by white women's and Black men's experiences. The interplay of these boundaries obscured the specific subjective experience of Black women's workers. On numerous occasions, Kimberlé Crenshaw has made it clear that her use of intersectionality has been and continues to be contextual and practical. Her aim was never to create a general theory of oppression, but rather a concept that would allow for the analysis of specific legal omissions and inequalities. As she explained, intersectionality was my attempt to make feminism, anti-racist activism, and anti-discrimination law do what I thought they should: highlight the multiple avenues through which racial and gender oppressions were experienced, so that the problems would be easier to discuss and understand. A decade after coining the term, Kimberlé Crenshaw joined the preparations for the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, a turning point in understanding global racism. Women participated widely, and the event highlighted the growing role of Black women in this fight. One key example was the pro-Durban articulation of Brazilian Black women's organizations, which made visible how racialized women experience specific forms of oppression in both production and reproduction systems. In a seminar in 2000, Crenshaw emphasized how gender and race intersect and how human rights discourses often fail to address these overlapping forms of subordination. She proposed intersectionality as a method to close those gaps. At the 2001 conference itself, intersectionality was formally adopted at the NGO Forum. From that point, the concept gained global visibility and began to influence international documents. The official report defined it as a way to understand how multiple identities shape experiences of discrimination. It's interesting, this definition, because we are talking about identities and discrimination. No, okay. After Durban, Crenshaw's work influenced policy, law, academia, especially in contexts like South Africa. The UN began applying intersectionality to highlight the diversity of women's realities across the globe, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean. However, as happened with the gender approach in the 1990s, institutionalization brought both gains and risks. Intersectionality entered academia and policymaking, but was often stripped of its political roots. It became a neutral, decontextualized framework, sometimes applied from above, that misunderstood its original purpose. Intersectionality calls for a shift away from single-axis analysis, like gender-only feminism or class-centered Marxism. Instead, it recognizes that forms of inequality are deeply interwoven and cannot be treated as separate. Behind the academic term lies the legacy of Black women's activism around the world. The real power of intersectionality depends on how and why it is used. As historian John Scott once said about gender, intersectionality is only useful when it is posed as a question, one that must be answered through specific struggles, context, and research. I go to the applications of intersectionality as a category for analysis. The adoption of intersectionality as a framework for understanding social experiences as enmeshed within a fabric of multiple oppressions rather than the sum of oppressions, and deriving that understanding from the corresponding epistemologies has been rather slow. There are various reasons for this, but one reason lies in the fact that there has been difficulty in accepting that an intersectional approach applies to all of us. Intersectionality can help us understand the daily lives of the people we study, but it can also shed light on power relations present within the social and educational organizations using intersectionality to study others. Often, despite the good intentions of those within these organizations' power structure, there is a perpetuation of gender, class, and race hierarchies. Moreover, in Latin America, a persistent obstacle to the widespread take-up of an intersectional political theoretical approach in which race plays a central role is the continuing adherence in Latin America to the narrative of mestizaje, to prove the absence of racism. This narrative describes these societies as fundamentally mixed race. It has been so powerful in the cementing of Latin American national identities that it has hindered acknowledgement of the existence of racism. Furthermore, it subjected those who point to its presence to moral delegitimization as racist, and dismissed those who maintain its existence as the real racists. In Latin America, racism is minimized, denied, or seen as something anachronistic or extraordinary. Racism is so naturalized that it is largely overlooked, to the point that it is only applied to circumstance of another time or place. In the United States, in the Nazi Germany, or in South Africa. The argument goes that if there has been racism in Latin America, it is a relic of the past, from colonial or pre-revolutionary times. People only perceive racism when confronted with explicit or violent acts of racial discrimination. Given this context, criticism of this foundational narrative are very welcome. Lelia Gonzalez, for example, has asserted that Latin American societies have always prioritized the Latin, in other words, a connection with Europe, and have silenced the importance of the historical existence and past, present, and future political agency of the Black and indigenous people. Lelia Gonzalez renamed the region América Latina to evoke the fact that Central and South America have always been more indigenous and African than Latin. It's important that allow even in the Center for Latin American Studies probably begin to talk about Afro as Americanidad. Her political cultural concept of Americanidad was meant as a counterpoint to the US discourse on Black identity in the Americas, which had become hegemonic across the two continents. It is also important to acknowledge that most intersectional studies undertaken in the region have focused on subjects who face oppression and exclusion. In this sense, the oppressed and excluded individual, the embodiment of otherness, crushed by systems and domination and inequality, has paradoxically become the privileged subject of analysis. Many studies involve a stacking of multiple oppressions, giving strength to the idea that there are some women who are devoid of any possibility of agency, and some men who are all powerful. The problem with this stance is that it ignores the fact that both women and men can occupy different positions at the same time, some of subordination and others of domination. Moreover, the most disadvantaged position in classes, races, and sexist societies such as ours is not necessarily that of a poor Black or indigenous woman. We could compare the position, for example, with the situation of young men of the same ethnic and social group who are more exposed to certain forms of arbitrariness, such of those associated with police controls. Common sense perceptions of the functioning of domination can be enhanced by the analysis of particular social configurations. Furthermore, a mathematical model of domination that paints its effects as cumulative does not allow us any insight into, for example, the way marriage and status interact in racialized contexts. There is a big difference between an interracial marriage and one that unites two people of the same race. In the Colombian context, my past research has allowed me to identify, for example, certain consequences of a marriage between a Black man and a white woman. The white woman not only loses social status generally, but also her reputation is damaged, as she is seen to have sexual tastes and desirable in a woman of her ethnicity or race. I began to understand that marriage, a patriarchal institution that should normally protect a woman against accusation of sexual promiscuity, lost its power when her spouse was racialized as a black man. I also saw that the gender, class, and race relations in which couples decided to get married were embedded, could not be analyzed separately. This because they were constructed and existed simultaneously in particular historical circumstances which imbued these relations with significance. Along similar lines, my research on masculinities in Colombia has challenged the homogeneous way that masculinity is thought about in the country. I have shown that a man's class and race affect the way their gender works for or against them. This means that men's masculinity is experienced and represented in different ways. Thus, there is a great difference between men who benefit from patriarchal and racial advantages and those who suffer most from the imposition of hegemonic masculinity and norms of white supremacy. The former generally hold positions of authority in the state, control powerful institutions, and are recognized by the media. At the other end of the social spectrum, racialized and impoverished men perform the least skilled, lowest paid, and least recognized jobs, and are among the groups most exposed to police control. The interlocking of classism and racism has shaped Latin American institutions since their inception in such a way that today they all share the same project of brutality, typified by police violence, meted out on racialized and impoverished young men. That police violence is connected to the continuous growth of the prison population and a long history of humiliation, dehumanization, and terror inflicted on these bodies has been made visible thanks to intersectionality. Migration as a process is shaped by multiple axes of inequality, such as gender, class, race, and migratory status, which influence migrants' access to rights and their experiences of privilege or exclusion across local to global levels. Intersectionality provides a strong framework for analyzing these dynamics. Adriana Pichitelli's work on Brazilian women in the sex industry highlights how intersecting factors like gender, race, ethnicity, and nationality shape the migration experiences. She argues that these experiences are rooted in Brazil's subordinate position in global hierarchies, reframed through cultural perceptions. She shows that stereotypes about Brazilian women, seen as naturally sexual and submissive, yet joyful, impact them regardless of their involvement in sex work, with effects varying by class, context, and skin color. I would also like to mention the research of Maria Jose Magliano, who explores the working lives of Peruvian migrant women in paid domestic employment in Argentina. Her research highlights how the labor market is segmented and hierarchized along ethnic, national, and gender lines. She identifies divisions between native and migrant workers, men and women, and even within these groups. Using an intersectional approach, Magliano shows how class, linked to job qualifications and education, migration status, and family dynamics shape these women's career paths. In other words, her research produces a narrative that goes against a homogeneous view of migrants, showing that the intersecting of these social relations configures the different possibilities for finding different types of jobs, vertical and horizontal mobility, and differentiated access to rights as workers. Recent research by Miriam Chakov has used the potential offered by intersectionality to analyze the effects of sociopolitical changes on the everyday experience of the new indigenous middle classes in Bolivia. Chakov identifies the dilemmas posed by two opposing narratives of social mobility for women who have experienced recent processes of upward mobility in this context of change. The first narrative urges young Bolivians to leave behind the indigenous and campesino and become professionals or successful mestizo entrepreneurs. It does away with the chola's pollera, the skirt, no? And braids in order for her to achieve social progress. Since for a long time it was impossible to dress and style one's hair in this way and aspire to access higher education. The second model, promoted by the political project of Evo Morales between 2005 and 2019, emphasized a change in values, the affirmation of indigenous cultural pride, and a woman's right to professional and business achievements. This search for greater equity included the appointment of male and female ministers of Quechua and Campesino origin in such a way that identifying as middle class and dressing in a chola style ceased to be a contradiction and instead communicated a political message. The chola has been converted into a gender symbol of the imperative of the two competing models of social mobility. It has meant that the cholas themselves, torn between different political community and family commitments, have faced particularly challenging and costly personal quandaries. This case illustrates the fact that interactions between gender, race, and class always operate in a specific social, spatial, and temporal context. Understanding social relations in this way keeps us from seeing femininity, indigeneity, and social ascent as given, fixed, and immutable. Meanwhile, the relational underpinnings of intersectionality show that the oppression of certain social groups is always interconnected with the opportunity and privilege of other groups. Privilege is never isolated. It is directly linked to the disadvantage of another group. Finally, I want to mention the work of our colleague Mónica Moreno Figueroa, whose research focuses on the intersectional life or lived of the intersectional lived experience of race and racism in Mexico and Latin America. She also uses intersectionality in her anti-racist, academic-based impact work. I recommend mainly our chapter on anti-racism, intersectionality, and the struggle for dignity. In the book titled Against Racism, which she edited with Peter Wade. Having outlined the uses of intersectionality as an analytical category, I will conclude this lecture by looking at the political dimensions of intersectionality. I want to examine what is at stake in the current context, which sees feminist issues gradually displaced from within the borders of the feminist movement to its edges and beyond. This encourages the forging of alliances and solidarities with other social movements that defend the interests of other socially minoritized groups. Back to the margins. Decolonizing the application of intersectionality. Latin America has seen numerous changes over the last decade. The reasons for this are related to the political shortcomings and lack of autonomy of the multicultural state project launched in the 1990s, the rollback of social and political processes and achievements gained within the framework of this project, and the exacerbation of social and racial inequalities and violence linked to the neoliberal model. One of the effects of the failure of the multicultural project wasn't a renewal of public interest throughout Latin America in the issue of racism, which had repercussions on the anti-racist work of many social movements, including feminism. In this new context, Latin American feminist ideas have been more clearly connected to the critique of racism, which is in great part due to the rapid circulation and growing acceptance of the intersectional perspective. Certainly, the sociopolitical context of recent years and aspects of intersectionality's itinerant nature have brought about a certain re-politicization of the concept. Intersectionality has acquired new meanings and, in a way, even reinvented itself outside the bounds of universities, in the streets, and in the struggles of social movements. In Argentina and Brazil, the notion of intersectionality is used to articulate and connect the movements and claims of indigenous and black women, rural and metropolitan communities, sexual minorities, and women living in slums without losing sight of their specificity. In America Latina, a region defined by multidimensional heterogeneity and marked by lengthy historical processes that have produced social exclusion, intersectional political thinking and action has entered into relationship with other disruptive political thinking and action. This means that intersectionality has been used to acknowledge and address the multiple and complex discriminations that characterize the experience of Latino American women. At the same time, it has been applied to pursue understanding of the historical origins of this discrimination and combat its source. This appropriation and application of intersectionality has prompted a repoliticization of the concept, where, to quote Angela Davis, what is at stake is not so much intersectionality of identities, but intersectionality of struggles. I am pointing the difference between the UN a definition of intersectionality and the term that Angela Davis is pointing out. Research such as that undertaken by the Afro-Brazilian sociologist Flavia Rios points to the emergence of a new generation of Brazilian activism. More forthright language has started to be used to illustrate more clearly the connections between feminism and anti-racism in the public sphere, with a view to problematize the multiple forms of social oppression. The adoption of a language of intersectionality goes beyond an understanding of how these two can aid social and political interpretation. This is because the term has become a category of collective political identity that has emerged amid the transforming public sphere and the dynamics of feminist and anti-racist movements, especially among feminists who have drawn attention to the limits of more traditional political activism. This new interpretation changes the term's meaning, where it is now not only a category for analysis, but also a category that shapes the contemporary language of political activism. It holds the terminology and the values that guide the collective action of those who engage in politics on the streets and online. Thus, the term has gone from a noun to an adjective that describes a new type of feminist belonging and, above all, indicates a new way of conceiving feminism itself. Intersectionality is, therefore, a reinvention of feminist thought and practice. It has created new solidarities that apply intersectionality as a method to increase encounters between different social movements and to counteract any hardening of identity politics. While identity politics has played an influential role in opening up new fields of struggle, there is always a risk of it becoming an obstacle to building a more effective basis for struggles against exploitation and oppression. However, the reinvention of intersectionality as an intersectionality of struggles, as Angela Davis puts it, seems to foreshadow a new politics of solidarity, rather than being based on a vague notion of sisterhood or the idea that some women unreservedly identify with others. This new solidarity is anchored in shared political and ethical goals. It allows for the construction of imagined communities, not around sex or color of skin as inherent or natural characteristic, but around ways of thinking and feeling about race, class, and gender. The return to the margin of intersectional political thought and action, in the words of bell hooks, chooses the margin as a space of radical opening. Hooks draws a clear distinction between marginality imposed by oppressive structures and marginality chosen as a place of resistance, as a place of radical openness and possibility. This place of resistance is a critical response to domination and a space forged through struggles. We know that a struggle is difficult, challenging, and tough. But we also know that a struggle is what pleases, delights and satisfies. And taking inspiration from bell hooks, we can imagine the space of intersectional struggles as a radical, creative space that affirms and sustains our subjectivity, and it grants us a new place from which to articulate our sense of the world. Closing remarks. Today, one of the most pressing debates in intersectionality revolves around whether intersecting inequalities should be understood in additive or constitutive terms. That is, are different forms of oppression simply layered on top of each other, or do they fundamentally shape and produce one another in inseparable ways? A growing body of critical scholarship challenges how intersectionality has been institutionalized, particularly within white-led feminist organizations. These critiques point to the widespread appropriation of Black feminist thought by mainstream feminist space that often center gender and isolation, while marginalizing or erasing race, class, disability, sexuality, and migration status. In many cases, gender is treated as a default lens, with other inequalities seen as secondary or optional add-ons. This instrumental use of intersectionality, often labeled as diversity within, risks reinforcing the very systems of domination it seeks to dismantle. For example, some feminist NGOs in Europe are seen as upholding whiteness, ableism, and cisnormativity, even as they claim to represent all women. In doing so, they obscure the structural and political nature of intersectionality, reducing it to a checklist rather than a radical framework for justice. Another key debate concerns representations and authority. Who gets to speak for whom in intersectional advocacy? Whose knowledge counts? Often organizations that claim intersectional expertise fail to center the voices and leadership of those most affected by overlapping oppressions. Feminist theory, movements, and organizations have long been marked by internal tensions, particularly as marginalized groups articulate their own experiences and call not simply for inclusion, but for a fundamental reimagining of feminist politics. Their demands go beyond representation. They seek a transformation of feminism itself into a worldview and social practice grounded in care for diverse lives, one capable of radically reshaping both present realities and future possibilities. Ultimately, these debates push us to ask whether intersectionality is being used to truly transform power structures, or whether it is being co-opted into institutional practices that leave systems of exclusion intact. As intersectionality becomes more mainstream, the challenge remains to ensure it retains its critical edge and remains accountable to its radical activist roots. In this context, contemporary Latin American feminism has learned to listen to new demands that stretch the boundaries of oppression beyond class, gender, and race. These include territorial struggles, both rural and urban, and diverse wide ways of understanding and living in the world. As Afro-descendant and indigenous communities themselves have long emphasized, and as scholars like Arturo Escobar have echoed, these perspectives are grounded in relational worldviews where life is seen as deeply interdependent among humans and with the non-human world. Concepts like buen vivir or vivir sabroso are not just cultural ideals. They are lived political practices that resist dominant development models and offer alternative visions rooted in care, balance, and collective well-being. They remind us that no single emancipatory theory can encompass all experiences, and that true transformation must engage with multiple ways of knowing and being. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. This is such an inspiring talk, and you're right, kind of to set this out. When you started the talk and with the ways in which the words being banned, and it feels very, a lot of us have been very depressed about a lot of things lately, and kind of globally in these struggles, but you showed just how, it's because just how powerful these concepts are and can be, right, for this, and I thank you so much for